Hi, my name is Phil Maynard, and I'm the Director of Discipleship Ministries for First Time Methodist Church in Dothan. And it is my privilege to bring you the good word for today. I want to actually share a phrase with you. That's a very Wesleyan phrase. It's at the very heart of who we are as United Methodists, and the phrase is means of grace. Means of grace. Means of grace are ways, methods, that you and I experience God's grace. Grace is defined as God's unmerited love. So God pouring into our world, God's love, into our lives, allowing that love to flow into us and through us. Means of grace are ways that you and I put ourselves in the pathway of that love. So means of grace are ways that you and I intentionally place ourselves in the pathway of God's love, God's transforming power into our lives. Now, the church has forever celebrated two sacraments. They are means of grace. Sacraments that were, in our understanding, they were ways that were instituted by Jesus himself. And of course, they are baptism and Holy Communion. So they are means of grace, ways that you and I get to experience that transforming power of God's love in our lives. Through the centuries, there have been lots of means of grace. We typically describe them as spiritual practices or spiritual disciplines. And they include things like fasting and prayer and meditation and worship and celebration and a host of other practices that place us in that pathway of God's grace. As we begin to prepare for our third Sunday in the Lenten series, which is focused around this theme of opening to God, what we're really talking about is means of grace. We're talking about ways that you and I can place ourselves in that pathway of God's grace. They are spiritual practices. So when you and I engage in spiritual practices, we're not just doing a routine, we're not meeting some kind of obligation, we're not doing some kind of ritual. We are choosing to place ourselves in that pathway of grace. We are choosing to allow God to pour God's love into our lives, to transform who we are and the way that we live, that we might better reflect the life of Christ. There's lots of ways that you and I can engage in this week. It could be as simple as getting together with a friend and sharing in what Wesley called Christian conferencing, where you and I talk about how it is that God is at work in our lives, and we celebrate all the good things that God is doing, and we share the struggles that we're having, and through that experience of sharing and confessing and praying for one another, you and I experience God's grace. When we gather for worship on Sunday mornings, you may have noticed that during this season, we're celebrating the sacrament of communion each week because it's a means of grace. It's a way that you and I get to experience that flow of God's love into our lives. I pray for you and for all of us that this week we will take advantage of the opportunities that we have to make that deeper connection, to place ourselves in that pathway, to experience the fullness of God's love pouring in and through our lives, that we might become more like Jesus and reflect the life that he intended for us. And that is your good word for today, means of grace.